This week on Rockstar Superhero. Midgar is a mythical city and bustling geometric metropolis found on the planet of Gaia in the Final Fantasy universe. My guest today, Andy Wilson Taylor, was greatly influenced by one particular game in the series and from which so many musical ideas sprouted. Andy founded Midgar in 2008 on the principles of symphonic expression, grand idealism, melodic compounds, kinetic atmosphere, and sonic synthesis. The term cinematic best describes this musical amalgamation and the subsequent material that poured out of his veins. Finding himself in another country over the last few years, Andy has found peace and uses his gifts to better our world, one note at a time. Midgar is unadulterated beauty and tangled rage, professionally forged into a glorious ally of inverted chords and passing melodies. This is my conversation with the gracious human, Andy Wilson Taylor of Midgar, on the Rockstar Superhero Podcast.
Is there something on your mind? And as this ever-growing chasm breaks between us.
Thank you so much. Where are you calling in from today? Are you in France?
Yes, I'm in the southwest of France. Yeah, not near the coast, a couple of hours away from any kind of coast, but yeah, pretty far southwest into France. Yeah, from the studio actually where the album was recorded.
Okay. So where? I mean, you don't have to give me your address, of course, but I'm curious, like which town or which general area.
So I'm on the border of two regions, the Dordogne region and the Lot-et-Garonne. We're technically in Lot-et-Garonne, which I consider to be the nicer of the two regions.
Yeah.
Just near, I'm between. Okay, do you know where Bordeaux is?
Yes. I was going to say Bordeaux.
Okay, and do you know where Toulouse is?
I know about it, but the only thing I know about Toulouse is Toulouse-Lautrec.
Right. Okay. So if you draw a straight line, kind of southeast from Bordeaux inland, you would find Toulouse in about 3.5, 4 hours.
Sure.
We're kind of equidistant between those two big cities, in the countryside, near to Bergerac, kind of half an hour from Bergerac. I don't know if you know that place.
Wow.
There's not really a lot here.
Yeah.
It's pretty remote and rural, which is why we're here.
Yeah. So farming communities, it sounds lovely and away from everything, but you're still allowed to be creative, which is all we really need, right?
Yeah, I can make as much noise here as I want to, which is great.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming here today, Andy. I'm really honored. I love your voice. I know I said this with everybody that comes on the show, but again, I don't have anybody on the show that I don't want to have. So
there you go.
I love it.
That's really kind. Thanks.
Yeah. The music is stunning. You're handsome. All the things are going right.
Thanks. I want to say I've got some ownership over those things, but actually I don't. It's just thanks.
Yeah. Just how God made me, Yeah, if I may, because you're in France, why did you end up there? I mean, I know you're farming. I know you're writing music down there. You're with your family down there. Those are sort of, the things we're going to keep off to the side a bit. But why did you fall in love with France? What was so special about it? And why did you make the move?
So I was living in Brighton in the UK before, and just working round the clock, 2 jobs kind of simultaneously. My day job, where I worked as kind of a retail manager, and then I was moonlighting as a composer for TV and film, and I was working remotely for the United States for the TV and film industry over there. A lot of advertising work and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Fortunately, the time zones worked out well. I wouldn't start work for the US until they kind of woke up in the morning. So all with a view and a goal to eventually buy a house, settle down with my wife, and do all those things that prove you're an adult, right? Get on the property ladder and have something to show for all this work you're doing.
Yeah.
And it became pretty clear very quickly that that's just not really possible in the UK.
Yeah.
Not in the way that you really want to. I mean, we could have bought something like what we were renting, which was a very small, pokey little townhouse. We were living on top of each other, and life would have had to stay exactly the same forever for us to afford to do that. We'd get like a, you know, £300,000 mortgage that we'd spend 50 years paying off, and we could just see that future stretching out infinitely in front of us.
Yeah.
And we thought, okay, well, is there any way that we can do something other than that once we've saved up enough money for a deposit? And it became pretty clear that we could buy a place for cash in rural France. And then you suddenly think, right, well, mortgages aren't necessary. What would I do if I didn't have to pay a mortgage? And like everything's possible almost.
Yeah.
I mean, we got very lucky that, I say lucky, it feels really wrong of me to like revel in the world's misfortune, right? That like suddenly remote work was normal,
Right.
but I guess we timed it really well by accident, that like being out in the countryside, out of a city, and being able to connect with the world remotely and still work in that way.
Yeah.
It's not such a weird thing to do anymore. Not in the way that it was in 2018 when we bought the house. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think we just got kind of lucky in that respect. And I guess we have the best of both now. We have the space and the freedom and the time to spend with one another, where we, you know, we're not working. I'm not working 20-hour days anymore.
Yeah.
Just to live and pay, you know, for a house. That was the goal, and somehow we've kind of achieved it, I guess.
Yeah. You know, that's incredibly motivating to me too. And I don't want to take this too off track, but I've been desirous of living in Japan for a number of years. My wife is Japanese, and
cool.
We've jumped to Japan many times on vacations, and we did spend a short period of time there in 2015. But yeah, the economy here in the States, especially in the Northwest near Seattle, where everything is mind-blowingly expensive, very similar to New York City or Tokyo, has really motivated, you know, my wife and I to, you know, hopefully someday soon take that trek to Japan, and specifically to what I would call the near countryside, right? The idea of having a country property within, say, an hour and a half of the city. So you have access to, you know, the things you need, and to airports and whatnot. But, you know, you're able to purchase, you know, a piece of property for cash and then rehabilitate it like you did your studio.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly it. And, you know, questioning what your motivation is, what's your priority, because like, why would we buy the house? Like, our goal was, we'd say the stupidest things. It's like, oh, we could do this so that in 30 years time, maybe we could have a place that, you know, we could get some dogs, and I could own a recording studio, and I could work less. And then we sort of realized, well, that's possible now if we just redefine what success looks like to us. You know what I mean? Like, we have less, we live a more kind of humble life, but we actually have the kind of, we've ticked the boxes for the really important things. And it's just about, I guess, realigning your priorities to what really, really is important to you, rather than just like, hey, I live in a city and I have the newest phone. You know, we don't do that anymore.
Having
but
the newest
we have
phone.
the gift of time, and that's way more important to us.
Yeah. I completely understand your perspective. I love it. Thank you so much. The heck was that? Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Let's talk about Midgar. I'm going to ask some stupid questions here.
You go right ahead. No judgment.
Stupid guy. I did as much research as I could, but I also like to leave a few holes. And that's because that makes this a lot more fun, right? Yeah. When I first heard the name, now you're going to make fun of me for a moment, but when I first heard the name, my brain said, oh, you know, like Middle Earth. And then I was like, oh no, why do I know Midgar? Why do I know Midgar? I know why I know Midgar, Final Fantasy VII. And you're nodding your head, so I have to assume I'm on the right track, that you were somehow motivated by this, you know, this video game and this powerful piece of symphonic art. And you thought, oh, maybe I could lift that, I could reference it, but I could take it into my own space. Am I on the right track?
You're spot on. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, that's it. So Midgar is a reference to, it seems a little narrow to just point it as being a reference to the composer of the music for that game, but that's the main motivation for me. Noboru Uematsu is the composer was the composer for the Final Fantasy game series back then. And I spent a lot of time with his music when I was younger, just by virtue of playing the game so much.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of realized as an adult how much of my musical education was made up of that music. And, I still have those melodies just repeating round and round and round in my head, 24 years later. And, but there was also a lot of other elements about that game and the way it was designed that I think have similarities with my vision for Midgar. And it was that kind of fusion of, I guess, nature and really harsh, like post apocalyptic industrialism, almost like those kind of two worlds colliding really, really chaotically in the middle. I think is a nice little metaphor for what Midgar does, which is a kind of combination of really harsh, aggressive, heavy, loud rock music, but also, orchestral stuff, lots of piano, lots of melody, lots of beautiful strings, and somehow they live in the same world. And I guess I kind of took that inspiration from playing a lot of Final Fantasy VII and the world that was set in, I suppose.
Yeah. I think this is why I'm drawn to it, Andy, because I'm a huge Final Fantasy person. I mean, you have no idea how huge I am about it.
Cool.
Final Fantasy VII was, of course, a sort of a game changer for Squaresoft back in the day when it was first released in 1997. But I'm curious, before we jump forward, did you play any of the previous games, specifically actually Final Fantasy II? I don't know what it's called in maybe Europe, but in Japan, it was Final Fantasy IV. In the States, it was number 2. So the second release. Right.
No,
I'm with Sid.
I didn't. I was one of the people who was introduced to JRPGs by Final Fantasy VII. It was, at the moment it kind of hit mainstream in the Western world back then, and I was 10 when it came out. So my video game playing time back then was more limited compared to how it is now. So no, I didn't. And actually, truth be told, it's something I've been planning to do, is revisit the games earlier in the series. But I played obviously ridiculous amounts of 7, and I still do. I played a lot of 8. I played 10 and 15. And obviously I'm obsessed with Remake, which is the best thing that's ever happened. So.
I've been afraid, I admit now. I know half the people are listening to this, their eyes are clouding over because they don't understand why we're talking about video games when this is a music podcast. But I've been afraid to go towards the remake. Let me tell you why. In 1997, I was going through the most brutal part of a divorce. And at the time, I had 3 small children, and I changed the character names to my children's names. So the lead character was Zachary, and another character was Gaia.
That's an unfortunate choice for the lead character.
Yes, and so it gets worse because I renamed Aerith to my youngest daughter.
Right.
Now, spoiler alert, 10 seconds. Okay. As everybody knows who's played the game, Aerith dies in Final Fantasy VII. And she dies. I mean, she isn't reborn. She dies. And it's crushing. It's actually crushing. I don't know why it was so emotional, but it's the one game that has somehow achieved a next level. And so in that movie sequence, I saw my daughter sinking into the water.
Oh my God.
And I sat there in front of my television weeping uncontrollably. It was a terrible, terrible moment. I've never forgotten it. I mean, it's really hilarious to think back at it. And yet it was just crushing to me. And so when I heard that they were remaking this, of course, the first thing I thought of, and I don't want to know because I actually don't know if Aerith survives in this version, because, it's a remake. It's not, it's a reboot in a sense, right? The opening sequences are much longer. Everything is much longer. There's so much more to the story. But I've been afraid to go back to have my soul crushed again.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was something we're all worried about. I mean, you won't find out the answer to that in the part 1 that's out at the moment. So
right.
We don't know, I think, is still still open-ended.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's the other thing too, before we move forward here is I didn't know, of course, until right before it was released that it was one of a number of releases. This wasn't going to be, the entire game on the first go around. And that's talk about trolling the fans. That's a tough one.
I know. So you can have this much. You waited 24 years for it, but you can have this much of it. I'm still there, man. I'm like, take my money. I'm ready to go.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, okay, so I want to get back to something because you had mentioned something a moment ago regarding Final Fantasy and the motivations to writing music for Midgar. When you play video games, as you enter villages, every village has its own song. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I considered when I listened to your music was that, he's writing theme songs for different villages. Okay. Now, are you willing to give that up, that this is an idea, that this is a conceit, or am I just dreaming?
It's really interesting you put it that way. It's not something I'd considered. But there's certainly individual elements of a world where a story's being told. So I think in that respect, you could kind of assign, you could, if that's the way your mind associates with them, you could assign them to places that you're going. That's not how I see it, but I know that, music conjures up very different kind of visual responses in people. I think that's really, really interesting. I think I see them more as scenes in maybe a film or chapters in a book rather than places themselves. But I love that. That's great.
Oh, I'm glad I could accommodate. Perhaps you can use that in a future release.
Yeah, it's a really, really cool idea.
Final Fantasy -0.
Okay, now we're talking. I like it.
Well, in regards to Midgar, as a unit, as a band, so to speak, it seems to me that Midgar is you. That this is, in a sense, your Nine Inch Nails. That you're the sole prop. And do you find it odd to reference yourself as a they, or as an us, or as a we, or do you think it's crucial to get the point across that it is different than, say, an Andy Wilson Taylor solo project?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and something I have wrestled with a lot with this release. I think partly because, like, Midgar has always been my baby, right? I formed it in 2008. I wrote the songs exactly the same way that I do now. And I wrote them with an intention of assembling a band, but I was like, I was at music school at the time, and I wanted to hand the songs over to people and be like, learn this, let's play it together, which is exactly what I did. And one of my classmates at music school ended up playing drums. He's phenomenal, one of my best friends. And we toured like that for a few years as a group. And the last time we were all in the same room was 2012.
Wow.
Which is when we were on stage at the end of the last tour that we did. And, we kind of knew at that point that we were pretty burned out by the DIY touring circuit, and we'd taken it as far as we could go, because like Midgar doesn't really fit into like a really nice, easy, like marketable box with a bow on it for a label to take away and just go and sell to the general public. It's a bit odd, Midgar. And like, I get that. And I think maybe our designs for the band, we figured that we were coming up against a bit of a brick wall and where we were trying to take the band at the time, and we needed to reset and just reevaluate and figure out what the future held for the band. I then ended up going through a bit of personal struggles like over the following few years that really just detached me from being creative musically and distanced me from those guys, and we just didn't get to spend any time together over the next few years. Ollie ended up just completely immersing himself in the session music world, and he's been doing arena tours, supporting Ed Sheeran, and like he was on the front cover of Rhythm magazine last year. I mean, he's completely taken over the world as like a pioneer of hybrid drumming. It's incredible. What that also means is that he's impossible to tie down in terms of getting in a room with him. So when I'd kind of got through my personal issues, when my wife and I decided to move to France, and it was kind of at that time that like the stars aligned. I was in a much healthier place mentally and physically, and I had the time and crucially the space to start making a Midgar record again. And it became clear that I was going to do it on my own this time. And while I've always been kind of the sole songwriter, I suppose it's different taking on every single aspect of the writing, the playing of every single instrument on the record, the production, the mixing, the mastering, like the whole thing from top to bottom. Like normally we would divide those tasks out amongst us to some degree. So for me, it was like eating an elephant, right? Like how am I going to do this? But I also had almost 10 years worth of creative material that had been boiling in my head for that whole time that I needed to get out. So that's kind of how I ended up doing this one on my own. But to answer your question about referring to it as they or, more than it being just one person, I think I'd never rule out the idea of us all getting together and playing this stuff again. And I think that's why it's important to maintain that it's a band project, but it is also, like you say, a bit like a Nine Inch Nails thing where like this music doesn't make sense if you call it a solo project. It just doesn't sound like one. And I think I'm worried. I don't know why I'm worried about it, because it's true anyway. I'm worried it sounds too indulgent if I just say it's all me. You know what I mean?
I completely understand that. It would almost be better. It's similar to what PJ Harvey does, where she gets together with Flood and writes, an entire album. And yes, of course, she brings in, the session musicians that she's worked with, or various producers who also have musical skills to be able to play guitar, drums, whatever. But it still feels at most like a duo, if that makes sense. And yet, because it doesn't say, Andy Wilson Taylor, your brain tricks you into thinking, oh, this is a unit. And I think that is actually really important, because it's good to know that you're, in a sense, the sole songwriter in those situations. It's nice to be able to give you kudos and credit for it, or to blame you if we don't like it, right?
You can do that too, yeah.
Right. But the nice part is it does actually sound like a unit. And I mean, if I may, I want to actually address a few pieces of your material that I've listened to over the last few weeks. And they're not necessarily in calendar release order, but they're as I heard them. And what I found so interesting about you, again, going back to the sound idea, the idea of different songs or different musical choices for villages, so to speak, is stylistically, I'm hesitant. I don't want to use the term "it's all over the place" because it's not. It is cohesive. It sounds like a collective thing that is singular, and at the same time, it's a very diverse sounding record, right? Yeah. But going even with previous works, things I've heard, I mean, first I'll just start with Sunburn. I love Sunburn. I think it's gloriously soulful. It's a musical confection. It's a candy to me. And I think it's because I'm a drummer. So I really like the punchiness of the mix. I love how upfront the drums are. But I really love how the verses and the harmonies travel in it. And there's a complexity to it that on the surface sounds like a joy-filled pop song. Yeah. But there's this melancholy that's sort of hidden in it. And what was your thought when you crafted that? Where were you at in your head?
It's a great question. I love it. Sunburn is a song about being vulnerable. So I guess it was kind of trying to tell that story of that moment when you're kind of willing to put yourself out there again and willing to be brave enough to be vulnerable. And maybe putting a little bit more of a positive version of yourself out there. I'm being really cryptic. I'm really sorry. It's difficult for me to find the words, but
it's okay.
I guess it was written about those difficult times that I went through, but then actually breaking through the other side of them and going, okay, I think I've got this under control now, but now's my time to you know, expose myself to the elements and be willing to get burned by them. And I guess that's where that melancholy comes from. But it is a bit of a standout track on Unity because it's a song in a major key. Like, I don't really normally write songs in a major key.
Yes.
And I think that's where the kind of candy, the kind of joyfulness thing comes from that you're mentioning, which I really like because I wanted the vocal hook in that song to feel kind of addictive and for it to feel like it was just looping round and round and round in your head. And that happened just because, like, the way I write melodies, I like to hear them first. It's just word shapes and vague melodies. And I could not get that melody out of my head, but it was really difficult for me to actually convert it into words.
Yeah.
So, like, when I did finally get there, it was just so satisfying. And it's a really cool song, that one, and different. And I think really it shows a more accessible side to Midgar. It's not super indulgent, really aggressive, angry. There's not big orchestral soundscapes and kind of widescreenness going on. It's just like, here's a pretty simple 3.5 minute verse, chorus, bridge, chorus out situation, which is a bit more straightforward, but I guess it's pretty honest, I suppose.
Yeah.
And yeah, I like it. And it's interesting you mentioned the drums and the punchiness as well, because drums is my first instrument. So yeah, I think you can kind of always tell what a mixer and producer's first instrument is by just thinking, oh, what's the loudest instrument in the mix?
Tends to be.
Yeah, so that's what. Yeah, I like the drums in that too, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to me, all artists. I mean, we all do this, and I'm not equating myself to you in this situation, but artists, we write about what's in our field of view, right? We write about literally what we're seeing. We write about literally what we're feeling, and we try to contextualize that for an audience that doesn't understand who we are or our perspectives. Sometimes we make them really obvious. Sometimes we're very, very cryptic, and we like symbolism, say like what Peter Gabriel does, where, he writes songs about trains going in and out of freaking tunnels. But we're like, dude, are you freaking serious, man? We know what you're talking about here. Yeah. But I'm curious, do you have to clear, and I'm not saying these songs are about your wife or struggles in your marriage or anything like that. That's not it. But are there times when you go to your wife, your family, or your friends and say, hey, I'm referencing you in this, and I want you to know that in advance so we don't lose each other?
That has that happened? It hasn't happened.
That's good.
I think the really interesting thing about like the actual content of the lyrics, when that moment comes and like I'm writing a song and I'm putting pen to paper and lyrics are coming out, you may know what I mean when it's like I don't feel like I'm in charge of that process. I'm not sitting down, I'm not like, right now I'm going to write a song about that week that I felt really sad. Like that's not how it goes. I think I sit there, and I guess it's almost like a meditative state of creative flow where like I'm in the moment and I'm present and I'm just focusing on the page in front of me and I'm listening to the music, and I don't know what those words are going to be.
Yeah.
While I'm writing them, I guess I'm just hearing them for the first time. But that also doesn't mean that I understand them when I hear them. I might not understand them until after I've written them, or after I've recorded the vocals, or after I've finished the mix, or like after I've listened to that mix like 400 times to make sure it's okay. I still might not necessarily know what was I actually trying to say there, because it's just it's just my subconscious reaching for the page through my hand, right? And it's only later I go, oh yeah, that was actually me kind of really understanding something about my life there, and now I get it, and it's with the benefit of hindsight that I understand it more clearly. So like when there are moments where I write about something that is more biographical and I think it involves a situation where like my wife might go, are you writing about that thing?
Right.
Like I think it's okay, because it's reflective and it's demonstrating understanding, and I don't think I'd ever write a situation where it's like I'm not writing songs like I really want to hook up with my ex again. You know what I mean? Like I think if I wrote a song that was just like that, she'd be like, "What the hell, dude? Like, what's going on there?" It's more like that's not a very complicated thing to try and understand, and not something that I'd be interested in writing about. I think it's more I guess I write about things that may be a little deeper than that.
Right.
So I don't worry about the people in my life reading my diary through my lyrics, as it were, because like the people that are really close to me, like they know what's going on with me anyway, hopefully. So no surprises.
Yeah, I love that. I appreciate that you divulged all of this. It's really easy to, when you're writing material, to look at it through that moment, right? I mean, that's why it's so difficult sometimes when you go back to say, wait a minute, what were the considerations here as I wrote these things out? It's almost like momentary symbolism, right? You're like, how do I make sense of this? And you almost have to, reconfigure it to make sense with where you are now as you're actually piecing everything together, as you're actually producing the final project. And it's a lot like, I talk about this a lot, but what's called the Texas sharpshooter theory, which is this idea of, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's this idea of, you shoot at a target with your gun and you miss it. But if you get far enough back, you hit the bullseye. If with enough distance, everything is focused, if that makes sense. And I like that idea within the concept of songwriting, because if you have enough time away from an experience, you can say, well, this is what I was actually talking about. And that may or may not actually be true. It's how you remember things, not actually how they were.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a really important process to have when it comes to redigesting whatever art you've created later down the road. I mean, it's so easy to be obsessed with what you're doing now and be like, what I make now is the best stuff I've ever made and it's better than anything I've ever done, and I don't listen to my old stuff because I hate it.
Yeah.
But like what you also will do is you'll fall out of love with what you've just done because you're like, I'm sick of it. Oh my God.
Yeah.
But like after a couple of months, you go back and listen to it and you forget all the constituent parts that stitch this whole thing together. You forget those dark moments in the studio when you were just like banging your head against the wall trying to get something done. Yeah, and you start seeing the whole thing. You zoom out and you get perspective and you think, this sounds really, really good. You don't hear that little snare drum that drove you crazy for 2 weeks.
We don't hear it either. I mean, we don't hear it at all. That's the thing. I mean, as a listener from the outside, I mean, our view is simply what you're presenting to us. So we're not listening for, the subtle mistakes in a song that would ruin the whole joy of music to begin with.
It can do, and that's it. Yeah, I ruin the joy of my own creations by getting too close to them, and I think that's normal. And beginning to hear it again, like the listener does for the first time, it requires a little bit of time away. And I like doing that with my older stuff too, where I listen back to something from 2008, and I'm like, oh man, like my vocal was horrible or whatever, but I'm like, actually no, it's just like a really honest portrayal of what I was feeling at the time, and I did the best with the tools I had, and that's cool, It's good to get some space and go back as a fresh pair of ears to something.
When I first heard Nemesis, I thought, and this is exactly referencing what we were talking about a moment ago, which is my brain said, wait a minute, is this a post like hardcore metalcore thing? Like have I completely misinterpreted what Midgar is? And this is exactly why we're talking. I mean, at least to me, because again, using the word diverse, you have this amazing diverse approach to music and songwriting. And I'm wondering how much politics or blasting your point of view on the state of the world out there, plays into your songwriting today, or has it always been so? Or is this just one of those, I need to get it out of my system moments?
I think it's very much the latter. I mean, I didn't set up the band to create a platform for myself to impose my point of view on people necessarily. But what I did do is set it up as a means to getting stuff out of my head. So it's not just like going round and round in there anymore. It's cathartic for me. And there were things that happened during the process of writing this record that just impossible to not be affected by in some way emotionally, there are things on previous records as well. I perhaps they're not quite so on the nose lyrically, because like I was really angry when I wrote Nemesis. I was like, man, it's
clearly,
like, oh my God, I got to get this out. And And I've only really felt that way once before, and that was actually a song that's really similar in its kind of timbre, and actually musically it's really similar. It's kind of the closest to metalcore, kind of post-hardcore, and that was a song "Lead Your Children to the Sky." Like those two songs have a lot in common musically, particularly the kind of screamy, shouty verses and the melodic singing chorus and stuff. And that song was written about a news story back in 2009 in the UK, which was just like horrifying and really affected me deeply. And I was like, oh my God, how do I decompress this and stop thinking about it in such a negative thought spiral kind of way? And my coping mechanism for that is to write a song about it. So by virtue of that, like some stuff's going to end up being political and some stuff is going to be, I guess, protesty by nature, because like, we live in a world where stuff's pretty crazy, and we've got to talk about it, and it makes me angry,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, and again, I asked that question because as an outsider, reading something into it that isn't necessarily true is how it works for all of us, right? We say, oh, I get it. You're a Brit and you live in France, but my American take is, oh, he's talking about Trump.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Which of course isn't even kind of, well, I imagine it's not even kind of, but that's my point. And I find it so interesting how music, we make it our own. No matter what's happening out there, we relate to a piece of music. There was a wonderful piece of music called Angels Have Fallen that came out in 1979 by Kansas. I don't know if you know who Kansas is. Carry On Wayward Son, a lot of famous songs. And this was not a hit. This was just a B-side on a 45 back in 1979. But that song today is still absolutely tears me apart. If I accidentally hear it on Spotify or on my own playlist at home, I will weep. And the reality is I don't really know why. It doesn't necessarily connect me to a time, but I cannot undo its emotional impact in my life. And I wouldn't want to.
Yeah.
Right.
It's funny how music can do that to you. It can be overwhelming. I think because music is the perfect way of tapping into kind of all parts of your being all at once. And I don't think human beings who feel things deeply, and like I know I'm one of those people who are like, I can hear a piece of music that really gets me in the right way, and I'm like, oh my God, why am I crying? What happened? How did that happen? But it's just because like it grabs you, and it grabs you in a way that nothing else can. And I think that's for me the reason why I enjoy creating it, because it also helps get things out of me in a way that nothing else can. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I move forward here, I do want to reference one more song that I think you might enjoy if you already don't know it. Are you familiar with a New York Australian duo called The Hi Hi's?
No, I'm not.
Okay. You must listen to this. They haven't released an album since 2016, I believe. They've only have 2 albums out and maybe one EP, but their first album was called Open Season. And the title track is like that. There's a level of melancholy in it that I've been using the term soul crushing too much. I've got to come up with a better thesaurus in my brain here. But it is gorgeous and complex and lilting, and it swirls. But it has these plaintive vocals in this chorus that absolutely move me. And now, 6 years on, my father passed away 6 years ago, and my brain, every time I hear it now, I've conflated that. I've connected the dots with that song with my father's death. So now I cry for another reason, but it's magical. It's a magical piece of music. And, when I hear that, when I heard Sunburn, there was something about it that connects to my psyche that says, oh, this is something I'm not going to forget. This is something that I'm going to take with me and carry with me. And that leads to my next point, which is, of all the bands I've talked to over the last 6 years and all the music I have heard and all the things I've been made privy to, you're the first individual / band that I can confidently say you remind me of Tears for Fears.
Okay.
Now, here's why. You don't sound like Tears for Fears. Nothing like. But oddly, it was the first thing that came to, I mean, we're talking within 10 seconds of listening. I said, who's this sound like? Who's this sound like? Who's this sound like? Oh, Tears for Fears. And it's funny because, again, hear me out. It's not like TFF at all, but there is this gorgeously complex melodic element to your music. And I think it's more really about the use of suspended chords, as the melodic progressions happen. And this is coming from a drummer now, so maybe I'm incorrect, but that's what seems to be happening. Pedal tones, I hear them, transitional notes that hold and keep a mood when everything else sort of dodges and darts over the top of it. And it gives me that feeling, which then led me to say, oh, this is the new sowing the seeds of love. It's the next evolution of that kind of thinking, that I can bring all these ideas and sounds and genres together, and it sounds like Midgar, but it's inviting and lovely and yet aggressive all at the same time. So it's really not so much a question as my thoughts on this, and I'm curious what your takeaway is from my takeaway.
I think that's really interesting. I'm not familiar enough with Tears for Fears to be able to directly speak to that, but I think one thing that you picked up on, which is really interesting, is the harmonic voicing, and like you talk about the mention of suspended chords and pedal notes and those sorts of things. And I think that probably just comes a lot from my classical upbringing musically, and right back through to the Final Fantasy VII game soundtrack as well, and that kind of orchestration, I suppose. I write a lot of my songs on the piano first, so I will sit there and I will come up with melodies and chords and feelings for a song on the piano. And I'd be interested to know whether or not the same thing happens for Tears for Fears, because I think that's the thing that informs the way the song sounds, regardless of what instruments I'm choosing to use to tell that story for that particular song. Like I'm creating the kind of harmonic structure of the music in the same place on the piano, and like Muse do that, right? Like Matt Bellamy clearly writes a lot on the piano, and that's sort of what informs like what Muse sounds like. Is his position of those hands on the keys while he's writing those songs, and I could do it on a glockenspiel or a violin or an electric guitar or a harmonica, but if those notes were arranged in the same order, I think they would still sound like the same song. And maybe it's the process on the way in that makes things sound like one voice. You know what I mean? Musically.
Yeah. You mentioned Muse. And the first thing that came into my head was Butterflies and Hurricanes.
Yeah.
There's that, right? It's very orchestral, lots of arpeggios. That's the Muse thing anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But when people say like, oh, what does Midgar sound like? I'm like, well, it's a bit kind of musy because it's rock music with piano and strings, but like that sounds like it sucks. I'm like, well, I don't think so. Yeah. I'm like, I guess it kind of does, but like it's in that ballpark sonically. Right. It's not Muse, because like they are, as you mentioned earlier, like a singular sounding band. No one sounds like Muse but Muse.
No, absolutely. Although Muse in the beginning tried to be Radiohead. I mean,
and that was my favorite Muse material. I mean, well, maybe not Showbiz necessarily, but Origin of Symmetry is definitely my favorite Muse record.
Yeah. Absolution. It ended with Absolution. They popped it up a bit too much when they stepped past when the Black Holes and Revelations, and all of a sudden we're doing Prince covers, basically.
I feel you completely. I agree 100%.
Yeah, drove me crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, crazy. Unity, came out in June, correct?
Yeah, June 25th it came out.
Okay. I know I've used this term a number of times today, but it is magical. There is something attached to it that feels sort of spiritual as it's fluttering in and out of this realm. And I know that Warren's is coming out sooner than later. In fact, I think it's coming out in a few days.
Yeah, 4 days time from us talking today. Yeah.
Okay. So do you feel that it's an extension of Unity, or does it stand as a unique piece on its own? Is it supposed to be, a companion or not?
Great question. How best to describe how this fits in? So when I was considering the release for Unity, I wanted there to be some kind of physical version that people could buy, but like in a post-COVID world, and like with manufacturing and shipping just being ridiculously expensive, and also I'm going to mention it for 1 second only, Brexit as well, like completely ruined my opportunity to sell to my nearest audience. So like I was met with a situation where I didn't have the I couldn't make a CD, I couldn't make a vinyl record, like it's just not possible. Couldn't afford it, no way. So the option of doing a limited edition audio cassette kind of came into the sphere, because that's something I could manufacture here. I could do all of the duplication of the tapes. I could print them myself, and I could do all that here. Short run, brilliant, handmade, love it. But
people
what
love
I needed,
it too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cool thing to have, and like it's kind of my musical upbringing involved cassette tapes, so it felt like a good choice. But I had 6 minutes on the back end of side B that I needed to film. So I think back to the albums that I grew up on and how they had bonus tracks on them. And the bonus tracks were, sometimes they were joke tracks. Like I think back to Follow the Leader, that album by Korn. And I love the track listing on that. First 13 tracks of silence. Love that. And then they had like a joke track on the end, which was, I guess they just got really high and just did whatever they wanted in the studio. System of a Down as well, like similar situation with bonus tracks and stuff. So I wanted there to be a bonus track on there, but I'm not really a joke track kind of guy. I'm not funny enough. So I wanted to write something that felt like an extra chapter. And back to video games. I grew up playing a lot of Doom as well, like the original PC Doom from '93. Played on my dad's Amstrad.
Incredible
PC.
Graphics.
Yeah, I mean, like, I was playing it so much, I would dream about it. I would dream that I was in Doom. It was not appropriate for a 6-year-old.
No,
but like, but I did. I played it a lot, and there was an amazing moment for me in episode 3 of first Doom, where there's a secret level, and that secret level is accessed from a level called Mount Erebus, by the way, which may have a link to a track on Unity.
It might.
It might, but this secret level did something absolutely incredible, which stayed with me forever. And when you go to the secret level, it was a remake of the first level in that episode, and I guess because computers were like relatively new in our houses at the time, there was a possibility that what you're experiencing was the game being broken, right? So like my immediate thought is like, I've been here before, I've done this, like what the hell's going on? But then as you play through the level, you notice that some details have changed. You see familiar faces, you've walked through all these halls, and these are lyrics from the song, and there's a kind of a gotcha moment at the end of the level where normally you would exit the level, the walls come down, and then you realize that actually all hell is about to break loose, and the game played a trick on you, and it's like, this is like a super crazy messed up version of that level where you're about to get your ass kicked. And that moment stayed with me just for my whole life. Like, wow, like how did they trick me into believing that my game was broken and then pull the rug out from underneath me? Blew my mind. And I think I wanted to have that same like bonus level mentality to the way Warren's needed to sound. So that secret level in that episode of Doom is called Warren's, and that kind of inspired me to think about, well, what is a Warren? I guess it's a rabbit hole. And I ended up writing the song about kind of two things simultaneously: that moment of playing that level where you feel like you're in a familiar space and you've been there before, but also I wanted to create maybe a labyrinth, like a rabbit hole of the mind lyrically, where you're in a space that's dark and enclosed and scary, but actually you don't ever want to leave and you're quite comfortable. So what you're doing is, instead of reaching for the light, you're digging yourself deeper into that rabbit hole. So it's really meta and like, it's interesting you talk about creating villages for songs. Maybe what I was doing was levels instead.
I think so. I don't think there's a maybe, actually. And I mean, really, I'm not trying to, of course, take your artistic vision here and turn it into what I think it should be. But I do find it incredibly interesting that really it comes from the very beginning, right? You've stated, it's like naming a child. When you call something, as in the case of the band being Midgar, you're saying to the right crowd, this is who I am. This is what I'm about. This is what has influenced me. You can't help but run down that rabbit hole, so to speak, and or that, those game levels, and sort of, in a sense, as your character in the album levels up, the songs level up. Right? You can't help but do those things because you're doing them subconsciously, no matter what. This is what has influenced you. Clearly, the subject of this entire podcast has really been video gaming in some form or another. Even living your life now, you're basically you're farming Gil.
yeah, that's true.
I mean, it's amazing. It's crazy. I'm envious as hell. But earlier you had said that your friend, the drummer, he's playing with Ed Sheeran. He's doing a lot. Do you look at that and you look at your life in France, and do you have regrets? Do you say like, oh man, I wish I had pursued that sort of a little more intensely, and because I could then become something? You see what I'm saying? The regret of making a different choice.
Yeah, completely. And it's such a good question. I think there are two assumptions being made there, which I have also made, right? In kind of wrestling with that. And that is, the first one is, am I good enough to have actually got there if I'd continued down that road? And I don't know if that's true. And it's just whataboutery, I suppose, at this point. Like, I don't know. But I think what I'm not, and this sounds ridiculous because like we're talking on a podcast interview where I'm like promoting a new record I'm putting out. I don't think I'm hungry enough anymore at this point in my life to do it at all costs. Because that's where I was in my like late teens, early 20s. And I'm like, I'm gonna be a rock star no matter what, and I don't care what the casualties of that decision are. Like, I'm gonna do it. What happened was, like, I was the casualty of that decision, right? So my life just went way off the rails, and I almost ended up killing myself, not on purpose, but just by like making some terrible decisions. And what came as a result of those bad decisions was some perspective. Like, all right, like, it's like we talked about earlier on when my wife and I were thinking about buying a house. Like, what's the end goal? Like, what's the end result really? When I drill down into, let's imagine if my childhood dreams came true and I was like mega famous rock star, I'm king of the world, I'm on the front cover of Rockstar magazine, and what do I get out of that situation? What I get is the ability to live my life by my own terms, hopefully, presumably, because like that's kind of what we want to do, to pursue my passion and be creative as and when I want to be, and to spend time with the people in my life that I love the most.
I know where you're going with this.
You know what the punchline is?
Yeah, you're doing it.
I do those things right now.
Yeah.
So, the only thing that's different about this world and that world is I'm not on the cover of the magazine. And like, who's that for? That's for a version of me that really cares about that, and like I just don't anymore. And it's like equal parts, I think, uplifting but also depressing, because it's like, oh man, he doesn't care anymore. But like, I care about what I do, I care about what I'm creating, and I care about it more than ever because it's not beholden to this idea of me that I think could be really famous and successful, because that version of me doesn't actually exist. It's just like I'm trying to please enough people that I can then be that guy, right? But
Yeah.
that, so like by doing that, I'm becoming less honest creatively, because I'd be writing stuff that I want.
Yeah.
I don't do that anymore. I write music that just feels right to me. So it's it's liberating creatively, and I'm at peace with it, and that's all I can say.
Well, I think it's clear that you're at peace with it, because you have this tremendous smile as we've been talking. You seem very gracious and grateful, right? You've been nothing but kind. And I don't want to weave myself into sort of your collective story, but your story absolutely calls and speaks to me in the same way, because I too, in a sense, walked away from something that I just got sick of. I got sick and tired. And, not to make this a religious conversation, but I mean, I was like, I really thought like God saved me, because when you get down to it, I had a number of opportunities to quote unquote, become the next big thing. And I made choices. I didn't willfully sabotage my future, but I made choices that didn't turn out the way, in a sense, I wanted them to at the time. But I have to look back and say how grateful I was that I had those experiences, and yet I didn't move forward in the industry, because I don't think I personally would have survived it. As a 55-year-old man, I still struggle greatly with the need to be loved and appreciated and be told I'm special. I mean, I'm kind of pathetic. But I mean, I say that with honesty, not to be bold and, with a look at me sort of like feel sorry for me. That's not it at all. But the reason I do this, and I think it's so important, Andy, that you shared this, is I'm doing this because I get massive joy in talking about things I genuinely love and appreciate. I love your music. I love cinematic music. I love what you do. I love how what you create inspires me. It translates to me, if that makes sense, right? And I think that's vital, because you're, like you said, outside of being on the cover of a magazine or having somebody walk up to get an autograph, really your life is no different. This idea of, untold riches is so 1% of 1% of 1%. I mean, your friend, I'm sure, is doing quite well in some ways, but not necessarily in the ways people think based on what Led Zeppelin did in 1972.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? It doesn't work that way anymore. It just doesn't, unless you're one of 3 big artists. It just doesn't. And so, I mean, I guess I should just say I applaud you for sharing that with us, but thank you for reminding me personally that, we're here because, look, if I had been famous, if I had become this famous, world famous drummer, and I'm touring all over the world playing, with Nickelback or whatever the heck, you and I wouldn't be talking. And I know that sounds crazy, but this is a great trade. Yeah. I get to talk to a genuinely lovely human being who has something to say, but doesn't need to make it about himself. You're not saying, "Oh, Rob, let me tell you about this album," so I'll fawn over you, right?
Right.
You know what I mean? You're just here having a good time with a new friend. That's pretty badass, Andy.
I feel exactly the same way, and I think it's so cool. And you've been so kind and generous about the music, and honestly, like, it's so cool of you. But I think the reason why it connects with you is because we have a similar story, and we have things in common, and I love that. That's what music's for, man. And like, the closer you get to that shining, burning sun of like success within the industry, the less honest things become. Generally speaking, right?
Absolutely.
Like, of course, there are some exceptions to the rule, but like, this kind of honest conversation that we're having here, like real, genuine, amazing conversation that we're having, I feel would be impossible if we were to fly too close to that sun. So I love being in the outer limits of that solar system. You know what I mean?
Yes, I love that. Thank you so much. If I may ask one more question before I let you go.
Sure.
We've talked about the word cinematic, and we've talked about, the idea of symphonic music and how it applies to everything from video games to, movies and commercials. And obviously you love that word because it actually translates into what you do. How do you see, and it's important, I want to use the word see. How do you see Midgar? And have you accomplished what you wanted others to see about Midgar?
That's such a good question. How do I see Midgar? It's difficult to describe because I actually have something called narrowband color synesthesia. So you'll be familiar with synesthesia, I'm sure, which is the very real and present experience of two senses at the same time that aren't normally meant to be experienced simultaneously. Like, I don't know, people can smell what the color orange smells like, for example. Right?
Yeah, very strange.
So when I hear music mainly, but sometimes even just like different sounds and timbres, like a whistle going off in the distance, something like that. It doesn't happen all the time, but maybe 90% of the time, I actually I experience visual responses to that, like colors, moving shapes, textures a lot of the time. And they'll be really, they'll range from just like what you'd expect like a moving screensaver to be, or actually sometimes they can be really canvassy and grainy, but there's always movement and there's always depth to the color, and there are very, very defined shapes. And actually those shapes, they're consistent. So if I can listen to one song, I listen to that song a year later, and I'll experience the exact same visual phenomena from that piece of music. It's really bizarre. To the point where until I was about 12 years old, I didn't know that this was like a thing. I just thought that's what happened to everybody. And I'd be having conversations with my mom, like, that song, like it's that's what it looks like. And she's like, what are you talking about? And it was only through talking about my experiences that I realized actually not everyone sees music in that way. So I think it's really interesting that you talk about how do I see Midgar. I see it through my very own personal lens, and I guess to answer your question with a thought rather than a proper answer is that like we all have our very own particular lens on the world through which we view it, and there is absolutely no way for you or I to know whether or not what we see is the same. It's 100% subjective. Right. I can tell you that the screen we're looking at, has a white background, but like your version of white could be very different to mine. I don't know. And so for me to think about how people, whether or not they receive the same vision that I have had for it, is almost like, sending my dreams through a computer that can replay them into someone else's head while they're sleeping. Like, I don't know if that's ever going to translate properly to someone at the other end. Like, I don't know. I think based on the conversation that you and I have had today, I think there are things which just cut right through, and it's like completely clear, like I was writing on a piece of paper and say, hey, here's what's going on here, and it's completely understood. And I think that's incredible. I don't know if that's my intention. I just think music's magic, like you say. And I don't know if I'm in charge of what I'm doing completely. And I perhaps we're tapping into something that we don't understand, and it connects us all. And without getting too cosmic, man, I think if you and I end up seeing the same thing when listening to a piece of music that I've written, then that's just one of the coolest things in the world.
It's time for me to change. You never worry about the pain from day to day. It's time to bring the feeling down one way or another.